Pasture effect. And Louis Pasteur observed that when yeast is subjected to aerobic condition, that is the presence of oxygen, then the glucose consumption and ethanol production drops. Okay, when yeast is exposed to oxygen, when it is exposed to aerobic condition, then the glucose consumption of yeast and the ethanol production in the yeast drops. Now the decrease in the glucose consumption is because of the fact that in fermentation the production of the ATP is like 2 ATPs per glucose molecule. Okay, there is production of 2 ATP per glucose molecule during fermentation, and during aerobic respiration there is production of 32 ATPs per glucose molecule. Okay, so if air is present, then one glucose molecule is giving a lot of energy as compared to in the absence of oxygen, and that is the reason why there is decrease of glucose consumption in aerobic condition. Now the generation of the same amount of ATP to perform essential metabolic activities, more consumption of ATP, more consumption of glucose is required during anaerobic condition. More consumption of glucose is required for anaerobic condition. Okay, this is simple. The amount of ATP that the yeast is going to require to perform its essential metabolic activities is same, whether you are doing aerobic condition or whether the fermentation is happening or aerobic respiration is happening. But in fermentation you are getting only 2 ATP from one glucose molecule. That is the reason why you will end up using more glucose molecule to generate that particular amount of ATP. But in case of aerobic respiration, from one glucose molecule you are getting considerably more amount of ATP. So that is the reason why you will not use that much amount of glucose to reach that particular amount of ATP that is required for essential metabolic activities. And that is the reason why during fermentation more glucose is consumed, and during aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen there is a decrease in the glucose consumption by the yeast. So that explains the reason behind this Pasteur effect, which is yeast consume more glucose when it is grown anaerobically and yeast consume less glucose when it is grown aerobically. Okay, in the presence of oxygen, yeast will consume less glucose and hence it will produce less alcohol, and in the absence of oxygen, yeast will consume more glucose, that is, it will produce more alcohol. Now let's see Warburg effect. Now most cancer cells exhibit increased glycolysis because of the fact that the most cancer cells uses glycolysis pathway as the main source of energy supply. Okay, but means the ATP which is generated by glycolysis, that is the main source of the energy. They don't perform the main source of the energy is not Krebs cycle and the oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, by doing glycolysis, then Krebs cycles, then oxidative phosphorylation, at last you get 32 ATP, and that is the energy source. Okay, but in cancer cells the glycolysis happen, the 2 ATPs which are produced, well, that's it, that's the energy source for the cancer cell. So that is the reason why they do more glycolysis. Okay, the cancer cell exhibits increased glycolysis in them. So this phenomenon is known as Warburg effect. Now what advantage does this cancer cell gets from exhibiting this Warburg effect is unclear. Okay, it is unclear why these cancer cells are using glycolysis pathway as the main source of energy supply. What advantage do they get from this? That is unclear. There are several biochemical and molecular studies which suggest several possible mechanisms which are the reason for this metabolic alteration that evolve during cancer development. Now, the mechanisms which lead to this Warburg effect in the cancer development are the mitochondrial defects and malfunction, then adaptation to hypoxic tumor microenvironment, then abnormal expression of this enzyme known as pyruvate kinase. Okay, these things makes cancer cell to use glycolysis pathway as the main source of the energy supply.